All right, welcome back, everybody. Hope you all had a good spring break. I know that spring break is kind of challenging because I almost want to empirically test how much information leaves all of your brains during spring break. I don't mean to tease you, but I found that oftentimes I have to do quite a bit of reviewing after spring break. Today we're going to talk about persuasion, and we're going to talk about persuasion again because I want this class not to just be about helping you become better speakers, but for a lot of you, the ultimate goal of speaking is to become better persuasive speakers. In order to teach you how to be better persuasive speakers, we have to spend some time talking about how persuasion works and how to do persuasion well. One of my big goals for you for this course is to be able to help you all find your voices. And I mean that literally in the sense of being able to speak and command a room, but also more figuratively in being able to get your voice heard and have other people listen to you and take you seriously. So we spent a little bit of time before spring break talking about persuasion. I'm going to strongly encourage you that if you haven't gone back to review your notes on stasis theory, or if you haven't yet watched that video on stasis theory that I gave you, you'll remember we had a snowstorm on the Monday we were supposed to meet. You'll want to be sure that you do that and go back to it, because we're going to be building on that today. I also have to warn you that this is probably the most difficult lesson that we have in lecture this semester, and I can warn you in advance that a lot of you are going to leave this room confused. That's a really weird statement for a professor to make, but I want to tell you that that's okay if you leave this room confused today. What I want you to be able to do is take good notes on what I'm saying and take good notes on the process, because what I'm trying to teach you today is to become better at understanding when you're being persuaded, how to unpack other people's persuasion so that you might unpack your own. When we talked about audience analysis, we watched a bunch of commercials, and I told you that if you're sitting in an audience and you feel like you're being targeted, and it feels really uncomfortable that the Facebook algorithm or the company knows a whole lot about you, and you don't want to be persuaded, part of what you can do as an audience member is to recognize that you're being persuaded, recognize that it feels uncomfortable, and try to challenge that persuasion. If we were all persuaded by every single message that we ever got, we'd all be exhausted all of the time, and we'd have no core values. We'd have no core principles to live by. So part of what I'm going to try and teach you today is how to become better at making your own arguments. But in order to do that, we're going to start with learning how to unpack other people's arguments. Because I think a lot of undergrads think that they're very good at persuasion. I'll tell you that I've graded a lot of speeches and papers over my time teaching. I think a lot of the times you're better, or you think you're better than you actually are at that. Sometimes a lot of undergrads are pretty good at making claims. They're pretty good at repeating claims. Occasionally, they're pretty good at providing evidence for those claims. But a lot of times, where our undergraduates struggle is with reasoning. And the reason for that is because nobody's really taught you it, or has taught you how to do it well. So when we're talking about persuasion today, we're going to spend some time unpacking the assumptions that a lot of people make when they make persuasive arguments, so that we can tell when we don't want to be persuaded how to challenge someone else's persuasion, but also so that we can recognize that when we are making persuasive arguments, that we can recognize the weaknesses in our own arguments and where other people might challenge us, say, during a Q&A session. So let's start off by talking about a little bit of persuasion theory. There are a lot of people in the 20th century who watched what happened in World War I and World War II. They saw a whole bunch of propaganda, and a bunch of social scientists actually got government grants to study the process of persuasion. Kind of cool, right? After that, after a lot of people were starting to get concerned with how persuasion operated, there were a bunch of social scientists who tried to put persuasion to the test. And they tried to figure out, we have some assumptions of how persuasion works. We have some theory of persuasion that's been handed down to us. We like to think from our own experiences that we know how persuasion works. Let's actually test it out in experiments, in surveys, and interviews, and social science to try and figure out how this process actually works. So in the 1960s, there were some leading theorists who have one of the still pretty provocative theories on how persuasion works. They call it social judgment theory. It's kind of a weird name for this. I first encountered social judgment theory when I was sitting in your shoes as an undergrad. I was taking a persuasion theory class at the University of Minnesota, and we learned about social judgment theory, and I'll tell you that social judgment theory, when I learned about it, made me really sad. And the reason for that is because when I was in your shoes, I was under the impression that anyone who really wanted to make a good persuasive case, if they made the right case, if they made it in the right way, if they made it at the right time, if they did everything they were supposed to do as the speaker, then it would magically work and the audience would be persuaded and people are just stupid, and if I can make the right arguments in the right place at the right time, they'll be smarter and they'll thank me for it. And that was my way of thinking as an undergrad. And I came across social judgment theory and it made me sad. What social judgment theory says is that everybody, when there's a persuasive question on the table, has a whole range of options from I strongly am in favor of the proposal that you're suggesting to I'm strongly opposed to it. So on the left here, I have the range of options. On the right here, I have, hypothetically, if I were going to ask a girl on a date, I have a range of options from, yes, I'll marry you, I've been in love with you since we were 12, to, I have pepper spray and I know how to use it, right? If I were to ask a girl out on a date, she's going to have a position that's somewhere along this continuum. That position where she's starting from, her gut reaction there is what Sharif and Nevergal called her anchor position. An anchor position is sort of where you are at, without thinking about it, where do you fall on this continuum? So let's say she's slightly opposed to my offer that we should go out for dinner, right? Maybe she says, no, I'm not really interested in you, but I have a sister you might like. That's her anchor position. It basically means she's a little hesitant. She's probably not going to agree to go to dinner with me. But maybe I try to be charming. I try to win her over. What social judgment theory says is everyone has that anchor position, so let's say she's slightly opposed. If she is slightly opposed, she also probably has what they call a latitude of acceptance. A latitude of acceptance is everywhere else on the continuum that she might be willing to go if she's listening to my persuasion. So she's slightly opposed right now. She might be neutral. She might be slightly in favor of the idea. Or if I really screw up and I'm really not on my game, she's probably going to become even more opposed, right? She might become more moderately opposed or strongly opposed. That range from slightly in favor to strongly opposed are positions that she is willing to accept or at least entertain, her latitude of acceptance. What Sharif and Nevergal also say is that most people, if they're somewhere on this continuum, probably have what they called a latitude of rejection. You can probably guess what that is. That is, after listening to me talk for a short period of time, she's probably not going to go from strongly opposed to strongly in favor, yes, I'll marry you, right? Very few people just ask someone to marry them on the spot who they've never met, and suddenly they're like, yes, I'll marry you. And if they do, it's probably not the best arrangement. Usually it takes a little bit of coaxing. Usually it takes quite a few dates before someone really gets to know you and wants to be strongly in favor of your position. What made me sad when I learned about social judgment theory is I wanted to be able to take people who are strongly opposed and make them strongly in favor of my position after one speech. Some of you also might think that way. I don't want to disillusion you of that, because after all, I think the culmination of this course is for you all to become good persuasive speakers so you can all have a voice. Your capstone project for this course is a deliberation where you're going to be making an argument that some governing body out there, the North Dakota State Legislature, the U.S. Congress, the United Nations, some other organization that has power, should, and then a specific policy that they're not currently doing. Now, it's very rare that after one speech, people are going to move very far on this continuum. They have a latitude of rejection. And what social judgment theory says is that persuasion is gradual. After one speech, it's unlikely they'll get you from slightly opposed to strongly in favor, though it does happen, right? We can all probably think of epiphany moments where we believed something our entire lives. Somebody told us it was wrong, and we're like, that's wrong. What else in my life is wrong? Everything is wrong. I don't know what to think. Up is down, black is white. I don't know what to make of this. What social judgment theory says is maybe it takes a couple different speeches, or maybe it takes speeches plus some rumination plus some time to get from strongly opposed to maybe moderately in favor. It might take us a couple opportunities. It might take somebody really wrestling with an idea in order to get there. This is not to discourage you, because after all, the good goal of a lot of your speeches is to try and get as many people over to your side as possible. So your audience is probably going to be everywhere on this continuum. You might be able to get some of the people more strongly into your camp, or at least less strongly in their camp. But it's something to be mindful of, that it's not always this magic trick that you give a speech and people switch sides. So that's one thing I want you to keep in mind as you're thinking about the process of persuasion. It's usually a gradual process. It's usually not this drastic thing. But we all know of moments where it actually is that epiphany, somebody switches sides because they never thought about something that way. Those are kind of magic words as a speaker. If someone says, I never thought about it that way, it means you probably made a really good speech. So we're going to work today toward trying to figure out when persuasion works, how does it work, and how do we unpack it so that we can get better at it? We're going to start with what we talked about 2 weeks ago with stasis theory. Stasis theory is just a short way of saying how we classify and clarify what it is that we're actually arguing about. Stasis theory is about having one argument at a time instead of having 30 of them, right? The example I gave you is you're fighting with your significant other about doing the dishes, and suddenly you're fighting about your mother's always hated me, and you don't know how you get from X to Y. You had 30 different arguments. Stasis theory helps us figure out what it is that we're arguing about, and helps us stay focused on that argument and learn how we might argue better at that stasis. So I mentioned that there's 5 stases. They go in order. The stasis of fact or conjecture deals with what is or isn't, what could or could be, what will or won't be. The example I gave you is if you got in a car crash, you and the other person are going to have different accounts of how the car crash happened, what happened. The second stasis is what we call definition. That's what is something. What makes X a Y? Is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Right? We have criteria for how we know what things are and what categories they belong to. The third one, stasis of causes and consequences, deals with X causing Y. That's pretty obvious for a lot of you. You can make causal arguments that if you do something, something else will happen. The stasis of value is where we argue about things that are good or bad, or ethical or unethical, or fair or unfair, or beautiful or ugly. It's value judgments that we place on the things that we like or dislike. Finally, we have the stasis of policy. The stasis of policy is somebody should do something. I'm telling you all this persuasion stuff leading up to your deliberations because I want those to be as strong as possible. Your deliberations are going to be at the stasis of policy. Somebody should do something. All of these are places that could be otherwise, and that's what makes them vulnerable to persuasion. Most of the time, they're also what I said were interdependent. Rather than functioning independently, what happens at one stasis usually affects the other stases. So I want you to be able to recognize what it is that you're arguing about, because that's going to give you the first part of the triangle that we're going to focus on today. The first part is our claim. Our claim is that thing that could be otherwise. It's what the persuasive speaker is trying to persuade us to believe. That's what ultimately the goal of persuasive speaking is. If I have a claim and you have an opposite claim, I want you to get to believe my side of the story. A lot of speakers are pretty good at generating claims, because that's usually where your thesis statement's going to be. A lot of speakers are also pretty good at the second part of our triangle, which is providing evidence for that claim. You all have been doing research for your first speech to try and find things to back up what your claim is. How do you know that thing to be true? Well, you know it from things that are not vulnerable to persuasion, or if they are, they're only minimally vulnerable to persuasion. The third link in our triangle here is the reasoning step, and this is where I think a lot of undergrads really struggle. This is where things are going to get a little bit confusing, so I apologize in advance again. Some of you are going to walk out of the room today and you're going to be totally lost. If you take good notes and if you get some practice with it, it does get easier. I don't expect that I can teach this to you entirely in 50 minutes, but I think I can teach you the building blocks of it. You can try it on your own, and I want you to be able to get good at the process that I'm going to teach you, because that's ultimately how you're going to know whether the claim and the evidence are any good and whether you want to be persuaded by an argument or not. A lot of times you've probably had the experience of sitting in an audience and not wanting to be persuaded by a speaker because you don't like the speaker, or you don't like their claim, you don't like their position on an issue, but you have a hard time articulating why you don't like it. What reasoning gets you is to try and figure out how you can combat the claim, because most of the time the reasoning is the weakest part of this argument. Usually the claim is just kind of there. The evidence is either strong or weak, but it's the reasoning that links the claim to the evidence that makes it worthwhile. That's what we want to try and figure out. So this is a little bit abstract. If you take nothing else away from our lesson today, take away this triangle. It's not just enough to have a claim and evidence, but usually we have to have some kind of reasoning that links the two together, or they're just kind of arbitrarily placed together and the audience isn't going to make those connections. So when we're dealing with persuasion, a lot of times what we're dealing with is what in philosophy is called a syllogism. There's a branch of philosophy called epistemology, and epistemology is the study of how we know what we think we know. It's how we make arguments and how we make reasoning happen in order to try and draw conclusions about the world around us. And most of the time when we're dealing with the realm of epistemology, there are some things that we know to be true that are universally true. It's going to be hard for you to convince me that 2 plus 2 equals 37. That's something that we know to be true. Usually the sky is blue. It's not always the case. That's when we're kind of in the realm of persuasion a little bit. What the syllogism does in epistemology is it's a three-part process for trying to take something that we know, applying it to something that we don't know, and then trying to draw a new conclusion about what we think we know from it. So I'll give you an example here. We have this starting point, all rats are mammals, right? That's something that we know from taxonomy, we know from biology. We can look at any biology textbook. It'll classify rats as mammals. So let's say I happen to adopt this mammal here. I happen to adopt Fred the rat. And I'm wondering if Fred is a mammal. But I know that all rats are mammals, and I know that Fred is a rat. Therefore, what conclusion am I going to draw? So I'm going to go ahead and shout it out. All rats are mammals. Fred is a rat. Therefore, Fred is a mammal. Good. That's what we're trying to do. So that seems pretty straightforward. We're still with me. That's how the syllogism operates. It starts with a major premise that's something that we know to be either absolutely true, like 2 plus 2 is 4, or likely true. It's kind of a general rule that applies in most circumstances. It's something that we know that we try to apply to the second part of this, the minor premise. The minor premise is the new thing that we're trying to apply it to. We're trying to figure out if Fred is a rat. Then what do we draw from the third part is our conclusion. That's our argument. Our argument is going to be at one of the 5 stases. Is or isn't, is or is not this particular thing, X causes Y, X is good or bad, somebody should or should not do X. That is what we're trying to draw, and we have to get there through this format. Usually we can't get there with just 2 of these 3 parts. There's a universal rule or a near universal rule, a specific application in our minor premise, and then that helps us draw our new conclusion about the thing that we don't know. And I give you this because we like to think that we know a lot about the world, but we actually don't know that much. When we think about it, a lot of things that we take for granted are not universally true. There's something that we are like 95% certain about, but not 100% certain about. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I'm going to give you a couple categories of syllogisms that will help you with the reasoning process. You'll see this more in action. The example that I gave you before is that all rats are mammals, Fred is a rat, therefore Fred must also be a mammal. If I'm going to take care of Fred, knowing that information that Fred is a mammal will help me figure out that maybe there are specific things I need to do to take care of Fred. Maybe it'll help me out if I'm going to buy another pet, should I get another mammal? I probably don't want to get another cat, right? A cat might eat my rat. That's probably something I should know. So we use syllogisms to try and understand the world around us. We've got a couple different types of them. I'll try to give you a couple examples. The first one is what we call a categorical syllogism. That's the all x's are y, w is an x, therefore w is also a y. So I told you a couple weeks ago that one of my former jobs was working at a coffee shop. One of the weird near universal rules, but not 100% universal rules that I learned while working at a coffee shop is that light roast coffee actually usually has more caffeine than dark roast coffee. That caught me off guard because I figured the color of the bean probably had something to do with caffeine content. But I learned counterintuitively that light roasts are usually more acidic. It depends on where they're grown. And as a result, they usually have more caffeine than dark roast coffee. So let's say before class I'm at the coffee shop and I order a large coffee and they don't tell me whether it's a light roast or a dark roast. But I try it and it tastes a little bit too acidic for my taste. I happen to prefer dark roast coffee. It tastes a little bit too acidic, so I'm going to assume that it's a light roast. The conclusion that I would draw is that this cup of coffee, if I just ordered a large cup of coffee, probably has more caffeine than if I were to order a dark roast of the same coffee. So knowing that information, maybe if I ordered a large coffee, I don't want to drink the whole thing right before class, because if I'm going to teach for 2 hours, I probably don't want to be too jittery. That's the kind of conclusion you can draw with a categorical syllogism. Starts with a universal or near universal principle, like all x's are y's, takes it and applies it to this thing that you're trying to figure out, and draws a conclusion from that. Another type of syllogism we can have is what's called a disjunctive syllogism. This is your basic either or. Some of you might have covered logical fallacies in lab a few weeks ago, and you might have covered either or the false dilemma or false dichotomy as a logical fallacy. Sometimes that is the case. Sometimes you have more than 2 options. So let's say I go out to eat for dinner tonight, And the waitress asks me, do you want soup or salad? And I happen to say, I don't like salad. What's the conclusion that she can probably draw from that? Her conclusion is, okay, he probably wants the soup. If I say I don't like salad, I only have two options. I ruled out one of those options, therefore it's probably the other option. It's likely the case that if she asks me that question and I respond that way, that she should bring me the soup and that I want to drink this, or I want to eat the soup, right? It also may be the case that this is not universally true, that maybe I don't like soup or salad and I just happen to say I don't like salad. Or maybe it's possible that I want to replace my soup with French fries, right? It's nearly universally true that if I have an A or B situation and I rule out one of the options, that we go with the other option. The third type of syllogism we can have is what's called a hypothetical syllogism. So we have the all x's are y's, we have either A or B. The third type that we often get is what's called a hypothetical syllogism. A hypothetical syllogism is an if-then kind of statement. Okay, let's say I want to play soccer tonight, and it looks like it's going to rain. The forecast says there's an 80% chance of rain. I'm saying that 80%, I'm thinking that 80% is probably more like 100. So I can probably get excited about going to my soccer game, but if it rains, I'm probably not going to play soccer. So maybe I'll bring my soccer stuff just in case, but I won't get my expectations up too high because if it rains, I probably won't be able to play soccer with my friends. What we're dealing with these types of syllogisms are reasoning. The reasoning is always in the major premise. It's that nearly universal rule, and that's what we're trying to figure out. So we've got a couple different types here, and I mentioned that syllogisms work better usually when we're dealing with absolutes. But all three of these examples that I gave you are actually not absolutes. They're things that we're maybe 80 or 90% sure of. Most of the time when we're dealing with persuasion, we're not at 100%. Persuasion, by definition, deals with things that could be otherwise. So see if you can try and work through these a little bit, because what we're going to try and do is actually learn how to do this in reverse. Most of the time, we don't always get that. So when we're testing our syllogisms, there's a couple things that we need to look for. If we're going to be persuaded, if we want to be persuaded by this argument that someone else is making for me, right? Some of you have taken classes in formal logic or in geometry where you start with something that you know to be true and you work down to a conclusion. So I have this funny example, proof that girls are evil, and it starts with girls are time and money, and it works down to the conclusion that girls are evil. Some of you might conclude that I'm a misogynistic jerk from this example. There's a counterexample that says men are worse than evil, but you've probably done this logical testing before. Part of how we test syllogisms for whether they are good syllogisms or not is what we call validity. Does it have a major premise? Does it have a minor premise? Does it have a conclusion? And are all three of those things directly related to one another? If so, our syllogism is valid. That is, it follows the proper format. We can draw that conclusion from the major and minor premise, right? All rats are mammals, Fred is a rat, therefore Fred is a mammal. That's the format we're following. The other thing we need to make sure of is that all of the premises in our syllogism are factually accurate. Are these true statements? Sometimes people will try to feed us things that are in the proper format, they're valid, but they're not sound. That is, they're not actually factually accurate information. Usually there's some kind of mistruth or half-truth to them, and so we have to be able to unpack that as well. So when we're testing our syllogisms, these are the two main things we're going to be looking for. To give you some examples, sometimes what we have are syllogisms that are valid but not sound. That is, they follow the proper format, but even though they follow the proper format, we can't draw the conclusion because the premises are not factually accurate. So I could say all flying animals can shoot lasers from their eyes. That would include things like birds, right? Or insects. They can shoot lasers from their eyes. From there, I could have the minor premise, dogs can fly. And from there, I should be able to conclude that all dogs can shoot laser beams from their eye. The problem with this is that none of the premises are true, but they do follow the proper format. So if the first two things were true, then we could conclude that dogs can shoot lasers from their eyes. But because those first two statements are not factually accurate, they're not sound, we can't draw that conclusion. The opposite also could be true. We could have syllogisms that are sound, that is, all of the premises are factually accurate, but they're not directly related to one another, and therefore they're not valid. So we start from the premise of, I had a sandwich for lunch yesterday. That's a true statement. We could also say that Nancy Cartwright is the voice of Bart Simpson. If any of you watch The Simpsons, you might be surprised to learn that Bart Simpson is played by a woman. Those two things are sound statements. They're factually accurate. What conclusion could I draw from these premises? There's a reason why you can't respond, and that's because you can't draw a conclusion. Those premises have nothing to do with one another. I could conclude hypothetically that the Earth revolves around the sun. That's a true statement. That's also sound. I can't conclude that conclusion from these premises because those two premises have nothing in common with one another and have nothing in common with the conclusion. So the premises and the conclusion are all true, but because they're not in the proper format, major premise, minor premise, conclusion, we can't draw that conclusion as a good conclusion for us to draw, and therefore we should rule it out. So we could also have situations where they are neither. The statements are neither factually accurate nor do they follow the proper format. All Germans spontaneously combust at age 34. My brother likes to eat bicycles, therefore I'm a pregnant cat. Makes absolutely no sense because none of the statements are true and they have no relationship to one another. That's what we're going to be looking for when we're dealing with syllogisms. Now, syllogisms are great, but that is very rarely how people talk in the real world. You're not going to give a speech and get up here and lay out a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. Usually what you're going to have is just a conclusion and some evidence to back up that conclusion. What you're going to do is you're going to leave the reasoning to the audience, and usually the reason for that is because the reasoning is usually the weakest part of the argument. So people don't actually talk in syllogisms in everyday life. If I were going to say, let's go to eat, you can probably conclude that I'm hungry, and that's what we would call an entity. If everybody talked as people who are hungry should eat food, I am hungry, therefore I should eat food, it would take us forever to get things done, and we'd get really annoyed of constantly talking in major premise, minor premise, conclusion. So we don't actually talk that way in everyday life. Usually it's just, I'm hungry, let's go eat, right? The missing premise there is that the top one, people who are hungry should eat food if they want to live, right? What we're dealing with most of the time in the real world is not the syllogism that you get in philosophy, but instead the enthymeme that you get from rhetoric. And actually the enthymeme is coming from the same place where we get a lot of our stuff about public speaking. It's coming from Aristotle's rhetoric, the book, The Rhetoric. And it comes from the Greek word thumos. What it means is there's usually two statements. You usually get the conclusion and the minor premise, but you have to fill in the major premise. Thumos in Greek means heart. It basically means that somebody's giving you some stuff that appeals to your logic and reasoning, but you have to use your heart, you have to use your gut, you have to use your reasoning skills to fill in the missing piece. That's what an enthymeme means, and that's what we're usually dealing with when we're talking about persuasion. It's usually a syllogism with the major premise, which is kind of that glaringly obvious, usually universal or near universal statement. We usually leave that part out. And the reason we leave it out is because most of the time that missing premise is not certain. It's treated as if it's certain. It's taken for granted as if it should be certain. But most of the time it's actually not. And so what we're going to spend most of our time today is learning how to get back from the enthymeme that most speakers give us to the syllogism that will tell us what the speaker is trying to reason. Most of the time when we're dealing with that major premise, or what Stephen Toulmin calls the warrant, it's a missing piece. And it's missing because it's usually the weakest part of the argument. So I'll give you an example here. I had a speech a couple of years ago that I got from a student, and the student's thesis in this speech was, the US Congress should tax fatty and sugary foods because it will fight obesity. We're going to try and work backwards here. This is usually what looks like an enthymeme. It's got a conclusion, it's got a minor premise. It doesn't have a major premise. So I'll help you out and learn to unpack this. What I'm hoping for by the end of the day is that I can teach you some examples of how to unpack it. And as you go off on your own, you can practice these examples and learn how to do it on your own. Because most of the time, unpacking the enthymeme and getting it back to the syllogism helps us figure out whether we should buy the argument. So let's start with our conclusion. Our conclusion's at the bottom. At the stasis of policy, we have a should claim. The US Congress should tax fatty and sugary foods. Period, full stop. That is the claim that the speaker wants us to accept as their thesis. United States Congress should raise taxes on fatty and sugary foods. Our minor premise there is the evidence that they offer to support that claim. Taxing fatty and sugary foods will help fight obesity. Reducing consumption of fatty and sugary foods will help fight obesity. The missing premise that we would have to fill in is that raising taxes would limit consumption, right? We have this argument that if something costs us more money, that we're less likely to buy it. Why do you think that might be? Somebody help me out here. Why do you think that might be? Okay, not a lot of you maybe have had to deal with budgets. If you don't have the money, you're probably not going to spend it, right? That's what this student was trying to say. If we raise the cost that it takes for somebody to buy a can of Coke or a bag of chips, it makes it less likely that they're willing to spend their money on that. That's the missing piece of what the speaker is not saying. What I want you to take away from today is what the speaker is not saying, especially in persuasion, is usually more interesting than what the speaker is saying. So I gave you a reason for why raising taxes on goods might lower consumption. Can anybody think of a reason why that might not be the case? If we make it cost more to buy a can of Coke or a bag of chips, why might it still be the case that people will continue to buy them? I'm actually asking. Somebody help me out here. Yeah.
If the alternatives are still more expensive.
Okay. So maybe I live in a place where I can pay $1 for a can of Coke. It goes up to $1.25, but it's still cheaper than paying $2 for a stick of celery. Okay.
They just want to eat that food.
Sometimes people just like stuff, right? Even if you charge me more for it, I'm going to find a way to still buy my bag of Coke, or my bag of chips, or my can of Coke. That was a nice slip there. My bad. Yep. Thank you all. So it goes. The other reason is sometimes raising taxes on things doesn't necessarily get us to stop doing it. Some of you might, for instance, remember a couple years ago, if you had to fill your car, it cost like $3.50 a gallon to fill your car. Now it's like $2.60, right? When it was $3.50 a gallon, people were still driving to Fargo. People were still driving to Bismarck and Minneapolis. It didn't stop people from driving because they still needed the thing that they wanted. So this major premise sounds on its face like it's a valuable claim. It's probably not always universally true, though. This is what I want you to get good at, unpacking, working backwards to get to that major premise, because that major premise often sounds good on its face, but often isn't as universally true as we like to think. This is where your critical thinking comes in, and you get to challenge other people's arguments. So when we're dealing with syllogisms and enthymemes, syllogisms work really well for things that are predictable, things that are nearly universal. They work really well for absolute situations where 100% of the time all x's are y, 100% of the time if this then that, or if this or that. That's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with syllogisms. Enthymemes retain our capacity for surprise and help us to disguise our logic. As speakers, we can hide that reasoning that is the weakest part of our argument, and we just kind of assume that if we say it, people will take it for granted. It works really well under conditions of uncertainty, when something's 70 or 80 or even 20 or 30% of the time is true. If you can learn how to decode an enthymeme and get it back to a syllogism, usually you can figure out the reasoning that's the weakest part of that claim, evidence, reasoning triangle. So that's really what I want you to try and do today. I recognize that it's challenging. I recognize that it's a little bit abstract. But here's the process for it, and I want you to actually take notes on this. If you're going to work backwards from claim and evidence to claim, evidence, and reasoning in a syllogism, the first thing that you want to do is figure out what is the conclusion that the speaker is trying to get you to draw. The conclusion is going to be the answer to one of the 5 stasis questions. So it's going to be, will it or won't it be? Or does X cause Y? Or should we do this? Or is this thing good? That's what you're going to try and draw out as your conclusion, because that's really what the person is trying to persuade you on. Working backwards from that, you're going to try and find the minor premise. The minor premise is usually the evidence that's given as support for why you should believe that conclusion. So sometimes you're going to get a statement. Usually the claim is the first part of the sentence, and then there's a because, and then the minor premise is the second part of the sentence. Why should I buy this claim? That's what you're going to start with. From there, you're going to try and remember the different kinds of syllogisms. We've got the categorical, all x's are y's. We have the disjunctive, either A or B, or we have the hypothetical, if this, then that. If you can try and figure out what the major premise is, you have to be able to find the closest link from the evidence back to the reasoning. It's the most obvious step between the two, and it seems like it should be straightforward, but most of the time it's not. It's the major premise that you're working back toward. If you're dealing with argumentation, there's a rhetorician in the 20th century named Stephen Toulmin who called this the warrant. And you're going to look backwards to try and figure out the unstated assumption of what the speaker didn't say. And then, once you figure that out, you're going to try and cross-examine or test that missing assumption. A few weeks ago in here, I gave you a fun maxim that I learned in high school: never assume because what? Good. Never assume because it makes an ass out of you and me. The major premise is usually the part that makes the ass out of the speaker. So if there's a speaker that you disagree with, this is the process that you want to go through to try and be that jerk in Q&A who undermines their whole argument. It's also the case that as you're preparing your own persuasive speeches, you want to get better at recognizing your own claims, your own evidence, your own reasoning. Because you might be able to recognize the weakest parts of your arguments, and you can take those parts out, or you can find better evidence, or you can make better reasoning cases for why it should be the case. So we already went through the example of testing our warrant with the fatty and sugary taxes, the missing pieces of what the speaker didn't tell you. There are companies who will probably oppose your fat and sugar tax because they will lose profits. Coca-Cola and a bunch of other companies don't like taxes on stuff like that. Right? A lot of people like these things and probably want to continue using them. Another missing piece that the speaker didn't tell you in that speech is that there are other causes for obesity, right? Sometimes people are genetically predisposed to be overweight, and it might not be their fault. So just because you raise taxes on fat and sugar doesn't mean that obesity is going to go away entirely. These are the kinds of things that you want to be looking for as counter-arguments to try and understand. So I'll give you a couple examples. We'll do a couple of fun ones first, and then I'll try to give you some serious ones to show you what this might look like in an actual speech. So I used to live, before I moved to North Dakota, I lived in Pennsylvania, and I was about 40 minutes away from the town of Punxsutawney. Punxsutawney is where they host Groundhog's Day every year. Groundhog Day every year depends on a groundhog named Punxsutawney Phil, and the legend has it that Punxsutawney Phil does or doesn't see his shadow, and that helps us predict winter. So let's see if we can start with our conclusion. What is the conclusion that this enthymeme is trying to get you to make or to draw? Anybody want to guess? I'm not interested in making you feel bad. Just want to test it out. Remember, the conclusion is the claim, and then the minor premise is usually the evidence that's offered for that claim. So what's the claim being made here? What's the thing that could be otherwise? All right, looks like we might need my help here. So the thing that could be otherwise here is how many more weeks of winter are we in for? The claim here is that there will be 6 more weeks of winter. It's a claim at the stasis of fact or conjecture. It's trying to predict what will or will not be the case. It's hard for us to predict the weather, but the claim is that there will be 6 more weeks of winter. Let's work backwards and see if we can identify the minor premise evidence that supports that claim. So I gave you the claim. What's the evidence that's being offered here to support that claim? What's that? Okay, the groundhog saw his shadow, right? The conclusion is that there will be 6 more weeks of winter. There will be 6 more weeks of winter because the groundhog saw his shadow. If we were to try and work backwards then, the missing premise, the warrant, the major premise here is if Punxsutawney Phil sees his shadow, then there will be 6 more weeks of winter. It's our hypothetical syllogism. It's an if-then statement. That's not stated here, and there's a reason why it's not stated here. Where does that logic come from? The logic that if Punxsutawney Phil sees his shadow, then there will be 6 more weeks of winter. Where does that come from? How do we know that?
Superstition.
Superstition or folklore, right? Most of the people in this room probably don't believe that Punxsutawney Phil, as a mammal, can predict the weather. He's not a meteorologist. He doesn't know things, right? The only way that we know this premise to be true is because it's Pennsylvania legend. And it's Pennsylvania legend that we still have a holiday around every year on February 2nd, right? There's nothing behind that reasoning of the if-then statement other than, well, it's just folklore. There's no factual evidence, and therefore we're probably not very likely in North Dakota to be persuaded by what a groundhog in Pennsylvania happens to say on February 2nd, right? That's the kind of thing that you want to be doing with these examples. Let's try another one of these. I'll ruin one of your favorite childhood stories. Let's talk about Cinderella here, right? We have this story of Cinderella. She goes to the ball. She meets the prince there. She leaves the ball. She leaves behind a glass slipper. She tries not to turn into a pumpkin. The prince goes looking for her, right? We all know the story. We know how the story ends. We have this enthymeme here. Cinderella must be the girl who left this glass slipper at the ball who was dancing with the prince. When she tried on the shoe, when she tried on the missing slipper, it fit perfectly. Okay, let's try and figure out what might be our conclusion here. What's the thing that could be otherwise? Good. Cinderella was the girl who left the glass slipper at the ball. It could be Cinderella. It could be one of her sisters. It could be someone else in town. We don't know for sure. But that's the conclusion that people want the prince to draw so that he can fall in love with Cinderella and marry her and live happily ever after, right? What is the evidence that's being offered for why Cinderella must be the girl who left the slipper at the ball? The shoe fits, okay. So the shoe fits, therefore it must be Cinderella. What is the missing premise behind that logic?
If the shoe fit perfectly, it wouldn't fall out.
If the shoe fits, right? We have the saying, if the shoe fits, then it must be this person, or hypothetically in the 90s, if it fits, you must acquit, right? That was used in the O.J. Simpson trial, right? We can test this out. So the logic here is that if the shoe fits Cinderella's foot, then Cinderella must have been the girl at the ball. That's the missing premise, that's the reasoning, that's the warrant here. Somebody try and think about why that warrant might be flawed. What's the assumption that if the shoe fits makes? Yeah?
Every size is unique.
Okay, every girl has a unique shoe size. It's part of the logic that's not being stated here. My wife is a size 8, my sister is a size 8. They steal each other's shoes all the time. So it's possible, we could argue, that Cinderella maybe wasn't the girl who left the glass slipper at the ball because different women do, some of them do have different shoe sizes, but some of them have the same size shoe, and maybe there was someone else there, right? We know that it's Cinderella because we've watched the rest of the movie and we know how the story goes and it fits our narrative of falling in love and living happily ever after. Okay, let's move on from there. We'll try a linguistic example here. I'll let you read this one here. Well, each time we'll try and get a little bit less help from me, a little bit more of you doing the work. So see if you can read this one, see if you can figure out what the conclusion is here. Then from that conclusion, see if you can figure out what the evidence is. And if you're feeling so inclined, see if you can figure out the missing premise or the warrant behind why this might be an argument that you'd see on the internet. Lots of internet memes make arguments. They're good ways to test this out after class. Go ahead.
I sort of talked completely forgot all the parts, but
That's okay. Try one of them. Let's start with the conclusion. Do you want to try the conclusion?
yeah, it's trying to say that the English language doesn't make sense.
Yeah, part of it is that the English language doesn't make sense, or put more succinctly in this particular case, the top red word and the bottom red word are equally valid ways of spelling the word fish. That's the conclusion that it's trying to get you to draw. Those are equally valid ways of spelling the word fish. Let's look at the rest of this. What do you think is the evidence being offered? What's the minor premise being offered for why these might be equally valid?
It's showing how the different parts of the word make different sounds, like GH and enough is F.
Good, yeah, it's all the top part here. We have enough, women, nation. We hear the sounds f, I, sh. Therefore, G-H-O-T-I should be pronounced fish, and we should spell fish G-H-O-T-I. That's the evidence that's being offered here. What is the warrant or the missing piece for what links that evidence to that claim? That's the harder part. That's what I'm trying to get you to today. So if we don't quite get there, that's okay. Does anybody want to try and figure out what links that claim to that evidence? What kind of statement would you have to make in order to buy the claim? I'll give you a hint that it's similar to if our shoe fits example. Yeah. You have to go with the phonetics of the word. Basically, the major premise that's missing here is all sounds in the English language have only one phonetic representation in letters, right? We know this not to be the case, and that's why this example is obviously silly to us. We know that the English language is a mess. I told you a couple of years ago that one of my other jobs was working in the writing center. And I worked at a writing center, and in my interview they asked me, how would you work with international students? And I said back to them, I've spent the last 2 years studying biblical Hebrew. The only thing that I could think of that would be worse than spending 2 years studying biblical Hebrew is learning English. The reason for that is because we have a whole bunch of exceptions for words that are pronounced one way. We've got silent letters, right? We've got lots of different exceptions. It's not the case that this letter is always pronounced this way. Therefore, we know that this is not a good argument for why we should spell fish the way that the top says. Let's try again. So we have this argument, leeches will cure what ail you, they'll get rid of all that bad blood. Let's see if we can start and find our conclusion. Let's see if we can work backwards from it. What's our conclusion here? What's the doctor trying to get you to believe or think or do? Okay, that's part of our argument. I don't think that's our conclusion, though. What's our conclusion? Yeah, if you're sick, the leeches will cure what ails you. You should put leeches on your body, right? This is an argument that a lot of people used in medieval times. They said that leeches will help fix whatever ails you. That's kind of a causal claim. If you put leeches on, then your ailment will go away. What then is our evidence to support that argument? Yeah.
We presume that elements are in blood.
Okay. More specifically, it's actually in our enthymeme here. Our evidence being offered here is that leeches know how to get rid of bad blood. Our leeches know how to get rid of bad blood. If you're sick and you put leeches on, that will cure you. What's the missing premise that would help us get to that point? This one's a little tricky, but we'll try it out. What is the most direct link that we could make from that evidence of leeches will get rid of the bad blood to leeches will cure what ails you? Yeah.
Whatever's wrong with you is in your blood.
Yeah. The missing premise is that whatever happens to be wrong with you when you're sick is the result of your blood. And more specifically, it's the result of you having good blood and a bad balance between the two. There was a belief in medieval times that there was good blood and bad blood, and that leeches somehow knew what the bad blood was and could drain it out of your system, and then you'd be left with only the good blood. Why might that not be a good medical practice? Think to our reasoning that we gave, that there is good blood and bad blood. Is that a solid reason or argument that we could make? Do we know that there's good blood and bad blood? We actually know from a lot of medical experiments that there isn't good blood and bad blood, it's just blood, right? I'm not trying to gross you out here, but good blood and bad blood don't exist, and if they did exist, leeches wouldn't necessarily know how to get rid of that bad blood, right? That's where we're at here. So this will take us to our participation question for the day. And you can try out this participation question. I'm less interested in whether you get this answer right or wrong, but I want you to try it out. We're going to give you an example here. Again, your process is to start with the conclusion, identify the evidence, work backwards to the reasoning that links the evidence in the argument. Take out a sheet of paper, put your name, your lab instructor, your lab section number, and finally your answer. I'm going to give you an enthymeme here. You're going to try and figure out what's the missing premise of this enthymeme. The United States should not intervene militarily in North Korea. There are no options for an invasion or strike that would not result in millions of casualties. This is an argument that I happened to see in a think piece a couple weeks ago. It may or may not be a good argument, but there's people in the military who are making this argument. See if you can identify first what the conclusion is. Work backwards to the evidence that's being offered to support that conclusion. They're both part of that enthymeme there. And then see if you can figure out the reasoning that's behind those two things. The reasoning is usually going to be the most direct link between the evidence and the argument. When you're done, you can turn that in here. If you're willing to stay around, I'm happy to share the answer and the rationale behind the answer. Again, I'm less concerned over whether you get this right or wrong. I'm offering this to you today as a chance for you to practice getting better at this. I I want you to be able to identify weak spots in other people's arguments, to be able to identify weak spots in your own arguments. In order to do that, it's usually to work through this process. So see what you can do. Again, your name, your lab instructor, your section number, and your answer. When you have that, you can leave it up here. If you're not particularly interested in the answer, you're free to go. If you are interested in the answer and the rationale behind it, I'm happy to unpack it for you. I recognize this is challenging. I hope that you'll all practice with it a little bit more over the next couple weeks.
So I have a question. In my public speaking course for our last major speech, or I guess the first one, instead of turning my overview or my outline in on Blackboard, I submitted it with my speech on Go React.
Okay.
And then I found out later that it was supposed to be submitted on Blackboard.
Okay.
Well, anyways, so I had submitted my outline on by the correct date, just not on the correct time. As soon as I saw that, I emailed my teacher, Hassan Park, and I still haven't received an email back about that.
Yeah, so all of the grading for this class happens in lab.
Okay.
What I can do is take down your name and
'Kay.
just let her know that you've been waiting.
Mhm.
She gets very
Yeah.
busy. She has about 120 students.
Ex-
And she's also
exactly.
conducting seminars.
Yeah.
But I
No.
want to make sure she gets back to you. And
Yeah.
it should be all right.
And I'll talk to her probably
Yeah,
in
so
lab
I'll do what I can
Wednesday.
to get her to respond to you.
Yeah.
That's the
I
best can do.
I figured I'd talk to somebody
Yeah,
about
thank
that and try and work the situation out
Sure.
because
Yeah.
I understand about maybe taking points off because I didn't have it.
Yeah, we'll see.
But I just want
It's
to
up
get
to Hassan's
some,
judgment for that.
yeah, I just want to get some sort of credit because I had it
Sure.
done on time. So,
Fair enough.
yeah. Would you like to take down my name or?
Yeah, if you just want to write it down.
Yeah.
All right. I'm guessing the rest of you actually want to know the answer, so thank you for sticking around and wanting to know. What did you all guess?
B.
C. C. B.
We're-
C. All right. I can understand why you think either of those. I'll tell you one of those is the correct answer. The correct answer here happens to be B. And the reason for that is because it's the most direct link between the evidence and the reasoning. If you think again to soundness and validity, most of these answers will not get you validity. That is, they won't follow the proper format where you can draw the conclusion from the major and minor premise. The only one that works is the United States shouldn't take military actions if many people will die as a result. The minor premise here would then be there are no options for an invasion or strike that would not result in millions of casualties. That leads us to our conclusion that the United States should not intervene militarily in North Korea. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, that's okay. Come talk to me. I'll unpack it some more. But that's really what you're after with that. Nice work, y'all.